Hi, I'm Brock Dickinson, and I'm coming to you today from Tiverton in Bruce County, Ontario, home of the Bruce nuclear plant, which you can see in the distance behind me, one of the largest nuclear facilities in Canada. And I'm going to use the opportunity today to talk about Canada's next economy with a particular focus on the energy sector. There are a series of changes occurring both within Canada and around the world that are driving interest in the energy sector and that help to explain why it's going to be so important to Canada's economy moving forward. The first of those is the geopolitical tensions that have popped up in Europe. This sense that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe has begun to realize that they have an over-reliance on Russian energy and that this is causing a rethink between Europe and its allies over where potential future energy sources lie. The second of the major geopolitical factors reshaping the rise of the energy sector in Canada is this resurgence in manufacturing. As demographics collapse in places like China and to a lesser extent in Germany and Italy, we're seeing manufacturing flow out of those countries and flow to other jurisdictions, including Canada. Now, one of the things we learned in the 20th century was that the growth of the manufacturing sector coincides with the growth of energy consumption. And in fact, the entire economy saw a link between energy consumption and economic growth through most of the 20th century. Round about the year 2000, maybe a little after, the patterns separated. As we moved into more of a service economy, the need for energy declined somewhat, and so economic growth and energy consumption were separated out. But as manufacturing flows back to Canada, as it returns from places overseas, we're going to see increased demand for energy consumption that is directly linked to continued economic growth in the Canadian context. And that same lesson holds true in a third area, which is related to the rise of artificial intelligence and other tools of the information economy. That we are learning that to deploy tools in the AI space, for example, requires massive quantities of energy, much larger than we had anticipated 10 or 20 years ago. And so that too is contributing to an increased demand in the Canadian economy for energy. As we shift to an AI focus in many of our industries, that will also require greater focus on energy. And the fourth geopolitical change that we're seeing is domestic and is a little more social in its orientation. Canadians have always wanted to do the right thing, and that includes protecting ourselves and the world against the impacts of climate change. But there's been a bit of an understanding that perhaps we've missed some opportunities at nation building and at economy building in that context that are worth a second look. And that as we rethink our position on energy and climate, there will be opportunities that open up in this space for us to pursue new directives, new actions, and new agendas that will actually see larger investments in the energy space than we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years in Canada. Now, some of that relates specifically to the oil and gas space, and I do think that we are likely to see substantial investments in oil and gas expansion. Some of that is, again, the geopolitical situation, that as we enter into Trump's trade war, we want to decrease our reliance on U.S. markets, and most of our oil and gas processing now relies on shipping our raw materials out to the United States so that they can be processed there and then sold onto the world. And in order to do that, we often sell our raw materials at a price below the global average. And so we're actually losing money in this process. And we're doing that in part because we don't have a lot of alternatives to get that energy to other places. I think that's likely to change as Prime Minister Carney talks about nation-building exercises, as individual premiers line up to kind of see where there may be infrastructure opportunities. We're likely to see an expansion of the oil and gas sector. Some of that will include the development of new pipelines and other means of transporting that oil and gas to markets like Europe that are desperate for our raw materials. And we can already see some premiers, Wab Kinew in Manitoba, Doug Ford in Ontario, thinking about alternate ways to get that oil and gas to market. So both Kinew and Ford have talked about ports and port facilities on Hudson's Bay. In the case of Manitoba, that would be an expansion of the Port of Churchill. In the case of Ontario, that would be an entirely new port and harbor facility. Who knows where that would be, but there's an awful lot of work to kind of get the infrastructure just to create the community, let alone get other supplies of raw materials into that space. But those projects are indications of the kind of thinking that's currently taking hold in the Canadian political sphere. The other side of the oil and gas piece that we really haven't done much about in Canada so far is the notion of shale gas or fracking. And this too is a very controversial idea, but one whose time may have come politically so that there's a greater acceptance around the opportunities in this space. And when we think about Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, there are all major opportunities in this space. And in fact, if we look at the scale of fracking opportunities in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, each province has opportunities in the $200 billion range, which suggests that although we have some technical and environmental issues to address and resolve around those projects, that there's going to be an appetite for moving forward with those. All of this suggests that one of the outcomes of the energy experiments that we're likely to engage in over the next few years is a rethinking of our approach to climate and environment. And this suggests a couple of things. First, that we're going to have a very strong and renewed focus on carbon storage and carbon sequestration, carbon capture, as we think about alternate ways to kind of have a positive impact on the climate. And secondly, that we're going to have to lean into alternative energies increasingly as well. So part of that is expanded capacity in wind and solar, but it also means major new developments in spaces like tidal energy, geothermal energy, and hydrogen and other forms of created energy that we might be looking at over the course of the next few years. The reliance on fossil fuels is likely to kick in a short term, but that buys us time to think about these alternate fuel sources as a way of kind of building out the sector over the longer term. And looming in the back of all of this is perhaps one of the largest opportunities in the energy sector, and that's the development of the nuclear sector. That this is an area that combines the advantages of green energy with large-scale intensive energy production that we see in traditional energy industries and makes those available at a wide level. New Brunswick, Ontario already have a very significant component of their energy mix that comes from nuclear sources. We're likely to see a pretty major expansion of those, of that capacity over the course of the next couple of years. At the time this video goes live, I suspect we're going to be hearing some announcements from the province of Ontario around support for the expansion of this particular site behind me from 8 nuclear units to 12 in the short term and possibly 16 in the future. But there's also a sense that the nuclear industry, as it develops, creates a whole series of spin-off opportunities in related sectors. As we expand our nuclear capacity, we start to see the emergence of other industrial opportunities. For example, the creation of medical isotopes in the biopharmaceutical space, which will allow Canada to become more of a player in advanced drugs and advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing. If we have the nuclear facilities, we will be one of the places that can become a center of that kind of an industry. Our ability to expand the nuclear industry also speaks to some extent to our ability to take advantage of emerging opportunities in that space with things like small modular reactors, the notion of small-scale nuclear facilities that are probably 10 or 12 years in the future, but our ability to kind of grow our nuclear technical expertise in the short term means that we're going to be in a really interesting place to take advantage of those opportunities as they emerge over the next decade or so. So combine all of this together and you start to get a sense of why and how energy is going to be such a major contributor to Canada's next economy. There is one other piece of this puzzle, though, that's worth touching on. As we look at large-scale developments in the energy space, this underlines the need for a creative approach to work with Indigenous communities. The concepts of reconciliation and economic reconciliation in particular, linked to that notion of the duty to consult, which is laid out in the Constitution of the country, suggest that as we look at large-scale projects in this space, we need to be working very closely with Indigenous communities. Now, if you're sitting in Bay Street in downtown Toronto or an office tower in Calgary, that just sounds like a bunch of DEI kumbaya kind of stuff. The reality is this is critical to the development of the sector, and nobody knows that better than the communities that have been doing this stuff for decades. Places like Fort McMurray in northern Alberta or Bruce County here in Ontario, they're places that have already taken major steps to reach out to Indigenous communities, to create Indigenous partnerships, to ensure that Indigenous communities have a stake in the economic vitality and vibrancy of these projects. And that's the path that we all need to be following. To truly develop the energy sector, there's an element of reconciliation that fits into all of that as well. I guess the bottom line is that regardless of your political perspective on different elements of this, from oil and gas development to climate change to indigenous relationships, it's important to acknowledge that the energy sector will be a huge driver of Canada's economy over the next 10 or 15 years, and we've got to get ready for the implications of what that means.